forsaken me. So it's possible to feel forsaken, even if it isn't the case. But also notice the emphasis upon God's mercy. Sometimes we hear that God's mercy does not show up till the New Testament. Well, here it is in the intertestamental period, and it will be in the Old Testament as well. My child, when you come to serve the Lord, prepare yourself for testing. Set your heart right and be steadfast, and do not be impetuous in time of calamity. Cling to him and do not depart, so that your last days may be prosperous. Accept whatever befalls you, and in times of humiliation, be patient. For gold is tested in the fire, and those found acceptable in the furnace of humiliation. Trust in him, and he will help you. Make your way straight and hope in him. Let's see if I can get this to scroll down a little bit.
Bernard Taylor.
Okay. You who fear the Lord, trust in him, and your reward will not be lost. You who fear the Lord, hope for good things, for lasting joy and mercy. Consider the generations of old and see, has anyone trusted in the Lord and been disappointed? Or has anyone persevered in the fear of the Lord and been forsaken? Or has anyone called upon him and been neglected? For the Lord is compassionate and merciful. He forgives sins and saves in times of distress. A little more here. Woe to the timid hearts, and to slack hands, and to the sinner who walks a double path. Woe to the faint-hearted who have no trust, therefore they will have no shelter. Woe to you who have lost your nerve. What will you do when the Lord's reckoning comes? Those who fear the Lord do not disobey his words, and those who love him keep his ways. Those who fear the Lord seek to please him, and those who love him are filled with his law. Those who fear the Lord prepare their hearts and humble themselves before him. Let us fall into the hands of the Lord, but not into the hands of mortals. For equal to his majesty is his mercy, and equal to his name are his works. So let's begin with prayer. Again, we are thankful that we can be together in this way. Dear God, we're also thankful that we have ancient texts like Sirach and the Septuagint and the First Testament and the Second Testament and all the writings in between them that we can learn from. I thank you for the opportunities to be of service today. We are particularly concerned about the children of the world who are faced with the prospect of going back to school or not going back to school, and how difficult that all is. We know they need to go back to school. We also know they need to be protected from this virus, and how to achieve those both is not altogether clear. So help those who are in charge to have discernment and wisdom and courage. We pray in Christ's name. Amen.
By the way, David, would you make me a co-host?
Yes, let me do that right now. Thank you for reminding me of that. I need to find you. I'm going down the road to see you. There we are. Okay, that should have made you a co-host. Are you okay, Forrest?
Fine, thank you, David.
Okay, very good. Thank you very much. And thank you, everybody, for being here from all parts of the world. That was chapter 2 in Sirach, Karen. And that, thank you for asking that. One can open that book almost anywhere and be blessed. If I had to choose between Sirach and the Proverbs, I would surely choose Sirach, no doubt about it. So I think that we can be certain that God inspires literature above and beyond and beside the Bible. And the Bible is the norm by which we measure other things, but it's not the exclusive source of our understanding of God. So, Jesus said a prophet is not without honor except in his hometown. I think Adventist biblical scholars are not without honor except in Adventism. We have many first-rate biblical scholars in our denomination, and we are in the midst of greatness, and we don't take each other seriously enough, and we sort of take each other for granted. But we have many very, very accomplished people in our denomination. For a denomination our size, we're small. We're only 18 million people around the whole world. We're very small, but we're disproportionately represented in places of academic accomplishment, particularly in the worlds of medicine and theology and ethics and so forth, history, whatever. So Ellen White encouraged us to get good educations, and it's paying off. One of the great people in our midst that we need to hear more from is Bernard Taylor. He has done something that I think maybe no one or only very few people have done in the last, 2,250 years. Can you imagine that? That's amazing. Somebody has done something that has not previously been done or been done only very rarely in 2,250 years, and he is there on the screen. Do you see him? Bernard Taylor, that's the one right there. So we're going to hear from him today, and we will hear from him in subsequent weeks as well. We are going to hear from how the Septuagint influenced the New Testament, how the New Testament was formed, how the Old Testament was formed, and how the Old Testament thinks about atonement in different ways. So that's all upcoming. But today we want to get acquainted with Bernard himself and enjoy that. I'm thinking of this interview sort of like the Golden Gate Bridge. We have one tower on the San Francisco side, and then we have another tower on the Marin County side. And the San Francisco side one we'll call Avondale College, Avondale University College, and the one on Marin County side we'll call Hebrew Union College. And our hope is that we can become acquainted with those two institutions quite thoroughly. And then, having done that, having learned something about Avondale University College and Hebrew Union College, we can go back and cover the space between them. But let's first create these two towers called Avondale University College and Hebrew Union College. And I see Bernard there, so let's begin by asking Bernard this question. If someone asked you, who had never heard of it before, what Avondale University College is, what would you say?
Well, first of all, good morning to everyone. I'm delighted for this opportunity. I've been attending this class for quite a few years now, and I'm welcome the opportunity to make a contribution. I've listened to many and my wife and I enjoyed attending to the class when we could, and now, of course, attending online. When we went there, Eleanor and I were both there for my first 2 years of 4 years. It was Avondale College, and not that long ago, it was Australasian Missionary College. I had heard of Avondale as long as I could remember. My father was a preacher, so I'm a PK, and many people didn't go to college in those days, and he kept repeating. My parents went there, met there, and my two brothers ahead of me and my sister had all gone. And my first year, I roomed with my brother. Avondale was it had been formed primarily as the training ground for Seventh-day Adventist ministers in the Inter-Union, as it was then, later to become the Australasian Division and now the South Pacific Division. I mentioned all these things to fit the background in for everyone else, and we'll move through without too much more detail. So all I heard was you'll finish high school, work for 2 years, and go to Avondale. And in those days, basically the two options for a guy like me were either ministry or teaching. My three siblings had become teachers. I felt a call to ministry. I knew my mother hoped that I would be, but I didn't feel pressure. So it was a place that was familiar to me. I had visited there with my parents, and the year before went up to see my brother ahead of attending. So it was a very comfortable place to go. And I felt right at home when I arrived there and enjoyed it very much.
Were you there when there were any theological differences?
When are there not theological differences in the down under? Yes, in a real sense, I was in between. That is, Robert Brinsmead had been a student there, was no longer there, but the whole division was very much under his influence. And one of my professors was Des Ford, let's put it up front. And he was a change influence in Avondale.
I didn't realize that Robert Brinsmead had that earlier and that widespread influence throughout the division as a whole, so that when Dr. Ford started, there was already a way of looking at things that deserve perhaps to be challenged. Is that correct?
Yes. And that's a long story, but that's where I was in relation between those two. Dr. Ford wasn't controversial at the beginning. Well, throughout my studies, it was 1979, October 27, 1979, yes, at PUC when he chose to go public.
Okay, but he was a successful teacher, I suppose, for many years there at Avondale. Who else was teaching at that time at Avondale in religion?
Pastor Jorgensen, he did not complete a doctorate, but he had a lifetime interest in further study and learning as much as he could. For my first year and a half, Elwin Salem was there. He was the Greek teacher. And, who else? I'm sure I'm missing somebody. And from the English department, Pastor Heffron. He was an amateur theologian, amateur in the original sense of the word. He was there because he loved the subject, and so he overflowed into that, although English was his primary background.
Okay, I asked Bronwyn this question, and she looked it up. And so here's a quiz. What are the official colors of Avondale University College?
Well, I know it's not black and white. I'd like to be able to say they didn't have official colors because, of course, you remember some of the graduating classes because they chose their colors every year, but I don't remember. What are they, Bronwyn?
I don't know whether you can hear me. Can you?
Yes.
Yes.
Oh, navy blue, gold, and white.
There you go. Navy blue, gold, and white.
I had no idea.
Now, what's the difference between being Avondale College and Avondale University College?
Avondale has only recently become a university college. And that's a term that I'm acquainted with, not familiar with, but acquainted with in Canada, of course. But I gather it's probably a British sort of distinction, but it's part of the progress on the way to being recognized. Avondale was not recognized for many years, and it has worked hard to reach this point, and it's an ongoing process, hopefully one day to be Avondale University.
I think you're right. When I was down there, I was a little startled to hear teenagers saying they had gone to college, because in Adelaide anyway, they were using the word college for secondary school. And so if one talks about a university college, that distinguishes it from secondary school, I gather. But now Avondale is offering doctorates, right?
Yes, that's correct.
So and I think Avondale is one of the very few private institutions in Australia. My impression is that the government runs most of the universities, if not all of them in Australia, very few private ones.
I haven't lived there for a long time, but that was certainly the case when I was there. But yes, there are many more. There was one in each capital city, and that was about it. There wasn't the demand and so the opportunity for further education on a grand scale like there are now.
Now, you mentioned that you went for your first 2 years at Avondale to college. Then what happened?
Sorry, I didn't mean to make that distinction. I was there for 4 years and graduated from there.
Okay. Is there anything else you want us to know about Avondale before we turn to Hebrew Union College?
Yes, I think it'd be helpful for you to know that in the mid-60s, when I graduated in 66, Avondale was run very much like a high school academy in North America at the time. Very restrictive for those who wanted to break to do certain things that were not allowed. I never felt the constraints, and I enjoyed my time there, and I accepted it as it was, and it was not unlike my upbringing, and so I felt quite at home with it.
Okay. Yes, okay. And, I think that that's an important issue because I fear that some people well into their adult years still resent how they were treated in their secondary and primary school settings in Adventist schools. And I think that at some point it's okay to move past that and say, well, okay, that was my past, but it's not necessarily my future, and not have to spend one's whole life or much of one's life being resentful about that. Well, okay, over to Hebrew Union College. What's its color?
Hebrew Union College is the home of Reform Judaism. So as Avondale was for training primarily Adventist pastors in its original foundation, although it expanded in other areas, Hebrew Union College is the home in Cincinnati, is the home of Reform Judaism. founded by Isaac Mayer Wise in 1875. So it was for many years just a seminary, to use a Christian term, for the training of rabbis. And only later did they add a graduate school, and really didn't add any faculty. So it was a great gain for them. And we were known as Christian Fellows and were required to be ordained in our denominations to attend.
That's interesting. I didn't know that. You had to be an ordained Christian clergy person in order to attend Hebrew Union College. Do I understand that?
That's what I said, and that's what I understood. But then I think back, there were others who weren't even in ministerial. There was a woman at the time, Southern Baptist minister in the same class I was, but there are others who weren't. But when I was enrolling, that's what was made clear to me. And in fact, Elder Bock gave me credentials from the Lake Union to assist me in attending.
Hi, that's something. So you had been in ministry some before you went to Hebrew Union College.
Yes, and I was in the ministry in Australia and New Zealand and Australia for 12 years.
Well, okay, I'm tempted to get into that in just a second, but let's keep moving. Tell us more about Hebrew Union College. Let's say, how do they compare physically?
That's a good question, something I wouldn't have thought to mention. One would feel, I felt quite at home because there were older buildings like at Avondale, and there were brand new ones like the library, but the classroom block had been there from the beginning. So it had the feelings of an important past, but distinctly placed in the present.
Avondale's quite rural. Is Hebrew Union College rural as well?
No, it's immediately across the street from the University of Cincinnati. And ironically, and it's not lost on anybody, the Catholic hospital next door is the Good Samaritan.
Good. All right. And so tell us about what your student life was like. How long were you there? What did you do?
I was there for 7 years. Incidentally, you may not be aware that I completed a master's at Andrews in 79, and then in the fall went to Hebrew Union College. So they had a rigorous program. There were 72 semester hours of coursework for the doctorate after the master's, so that's 3 full years. And almost every class was language-based, and I had the opportunity to study many languages, and it was a really great experience. I was in a sense in a state of excitement because there were so many opportunities and so much to learn with world-class professors. My major professor, Dr. Kaufman, was the world's top Aramaicist, and it just drew you out. There was sort of like a magnet, an iron to all of this material to learn.
Did you feel that you had some catching up to do because you came from an Adventist background, and that maybe you weren't as prepared as the others, or did you not feel that?
Both are true. On the one hand, nobody knew the stories of the Old Testament, nobody there better than I did. But they all had degrees in Old Testament theology, and I didn't. So I had to pay a lot of catch up, and there wasn't much emphasis on the stories. They were not a great feature of the classes. But I also attended Sydney University and did a Hebrew major before I came to America. I was there for 3 years, and we had Hebrew 5 days a week. And so it was a wonderful introduction and opportunity.
Okay, I need to quickly recap. I don't know if starting on either end of this is working out, but let's see. So you're at Avondale and you go into the ministry.
Yes.
And then you do a degree at Sydney University while a pastor?
Yes. The last 3 years before I came here.
Okay. And did your conference leaders know that?
Oh, yes.
Uh-huh.
And you talked about a state institution. The only thing that it cost me were the student union fees were $95. Tuition was free. So it didn't cost the conference anything. And yes, I cleared it with them and I had their approval and I worked my way through it.
Okay, so you've done your ministry and you've done degrees at Avondale. And did you graduate from Sydney University?
No, I just did a major.
Okay. And then from there you go to Andrews?
Yes.
And with whom did you study there?
Larry Garrity, Abe Terrian, what was his first name? Rice, not Rick. Anyway, he was in New Testament and he later went to the wider state.
Not George Rice.
George Rice. Yes, thank you.
Uh-huh. Why, that's a high-powered team. So back to Hebrew Union College. Tell us how many students were there, and were they all Reform Jews, or did you have any Orthodox Jews? Did you have any conservative Jews?
I believe there were Orthodox Jews who were at HUC because they didn't get into the yeshiva in New York, which is a training school for them. And and there must have been some conservatives as well, a minority. They all seemed to get along well together, but it was principally Reform Jews. Training rabbis were the main ones that were there.
How many in the student body altogether, approximately?
I don't know that I ever knew that. If I'd looked this far ahead, I would have asked at the time.
That's all right. What were classes like? Were they small seminars? Were they lectures? Did you have a mix of those?
They were small. Well, almost all were small. In my second year, I was in with the rabbinic students. In fact, the rabbinic students would have divided into two classes. I would say, now that I think about it, there were probably 100 in each year of rabbis. Were we that big? Anyway, maybe 75 to 100. And so I sat with them in the 2 semesters of Midrash. So that was a big class. The first Aramaic class was about 20, but generally we were 7 to 10 in a class. A lot of discussion, not much lecturing in classes that I had. We were reading text. And so we took turns reading and translating, reading the Hebrew or Aramaic or whatever it was, and translating and then discussing. And that's where I learned to be able to see what the text said. And then that was the basis for knowing what it meant. And that was my primary objective.
Now, you made a distinction between what the text said and what it meant. Some people will say between what it meant and what it means. Are those the same thing or different? What it said and what it meant on the one hand, or what it meant and what it means on the other?
No, actually, that's an important. Those are important, but that's not what I had in mind. When I left Avondale, I knew how to give a Bible study. I didn't know how to study the Bible because of the overarching doctrinal emphasis of Adventism. The doctrines kept us from the text, and it was a very laborious task learning to be able to see and hear and understand what the text itself meant. And my working life has been spent learning to do that.
Hi, that's an interesting line. I knew how to give a Bible study, but I didn't know how to study the Bible. That's very, very interesting. Now, to what extent did people at Hebrew Union College study Christian origins? Did they have any courses in the New Testament? Did they have any course? Go ahead.
Yes, that was a different track than what I was on. But yes, Dr. Cook was the one who taught that. And he was very well informed in Christianity and the early days and the traditions and the Gospels. Their readings weren't synonymous with ours. And there were Christian fellows who came there to study that. At Hebrew Union College, you went down the Jewish side, but on the Christian side, there were fundamentalists who came to study Hebrew only. They just wanted to be taught Hebrew. They didn't want to know anything about Judaism or its interpretations. And because for fundamentalists, language is a safe area. Exegesis is a very hazardous area because of the closely held beliefs and interpretations that underlie it. And some were interested in the ancient Near East, and I started there for a year, and then I moved to text and versions when I learned that that's what my heart beat for. And so there were wide varieties. We, for the most part, did not parade our denominational differences. In fact, very rarely. And so it was a very positive area to study, and we were all keen to learn, and we all did our preparations. And now, wasn't all harmony. There were clashes, but that's part of the academic world. That's why we go into it, because we need to hear the different perspectives.
Boy, you use that word perspectives, and I was just going to ask you about that. Now we hear a lot about perspectivalism and what the text means to me directly. I can spend less time studying what it meant in its original context because we really can't recover the author's intent, we increasingly hear. So what we need to be attentive to is not the author's intent, but our understanding of what the author means to us. Was there anything along those lines going on there?
Yes, although it was quite early days. Robert Alter had written his first book, and David Gilner, who now has retired from being librarian, wrote his dissertation guided by Alter and the author intent versus the reader response. But in general, my time there was just ahead of that. And the circles in which I moved were mainly interested in linguistics. And again, what the text said. You don't know what the text means until you know what the text says. And that's what I went looking for, and that's what I luxuriated in.
Did you take any of the Christian origins courses? And if so, how did their reading of our texts compare to our reading of those texts?
No, I didn't. As you can gather from the years that I spent in ministry, compared to the rest of you, you and Rick and Jim and so on, I was 34 when I came to America. So I decided to cut a path down the middle. And so I worked closely with my professor so that when the 3 years are up, I had finished my coursework. I could have studied Arabic, but it was too big to take on at that time, and I wasn't willing to spend the extra time to do it. And so, but each semester, there was a buffet. I want to say smorgasbord, but nobody seems to know what that is these days much, of just the most wonderful classes. You mentally salivated at the sight of it. So I'd wait for that to subside and go to my professor and say, now, what do I need here? So at the end of the 3 years, I had my major in place. A lot of students went 5, 7 years and said, I better prepare for comprehensives, and found they didn't have an emphasis in any area, and so they had to do more coursework. And I was paying my own expenses, well, what the Hebrew Union College didn't pay for. The difference between the two, Avondale, I paid to go. My father paid, and I worked as well. But at HUC, I was on a full fellowship and actually received an unprecedented 6 years. And because the first year was tuition only. And so the next 3 years after I left were writing my dissertation.
And the fellowship came from Hebrew Union College?
Yes. They invested heavily in us with no expectations in return except for our scholarship for the rest of our lives.
That's remarkable. To what extent were the Old Testament, what we would call the Old Testament or the Hebrew Scriptures, to what extent was that scholarship akin to what we would find elsewhere, JBPD and that sort of thing, source criticism, or were they in dialogue with that? Were they very much engaged with that? Did they adopt that kind of source analysis, or did they regard that as something that only Christians or seculars get involved in?
You've given me an opportunity just to say a quick contrast again between the two. At Avondale College, I mentioned that it was a tight curriculum. There was very little choice. At Hebrew Union College, when I arrived there, it was, shall I say, an open campus academically. There were there wasn't a list of presuppositions within which the curriculum was contained. And as I said, there was such a wide choice that was available. And so I luxuriated in this, but some students came along a few years, 1 or 2 years behind me, and they were very upset that everything wasn't rigorous and regulated and defined, and drew up a protest and submitted it to the board, and the dean was replaced. And I was very disappointed.
Mm-hmm. Wow, that's sort of dramatic. Now you did. Go ahead.
Just the rest of now your question. Yes, well, remember the openness. So for some professors, JEPD is the background, source criticism. For others, less so, and we live with that. That's what we were there for. And so each taught from their own commitment, and we listened from their perspectives because one was not criticizing the other, and it left us free to choose, and I found that very helpful.
That's wonderful. Now, you not only studied there, that is, you not only went to courses and not only went to seminars and not only did your independent research, but you did some teaching as well, correct?
Correct. If you, some of you, I think, will be associated with some Yiddish, and well, we all have some, but the word goy, which is a good Hebrew word, which means nations. But in Yiddish, it's a derogatory term for a non-Jew. And so, of course, we were goys amongst these Jews, and that created a situation. Now refresh me on your question.
You did some teaching there?
Yes. So when I'd finished my coursework, Dr. Cook that I mentioned, who taught in New Testament, taught rabbinics to the second-year rabbinic students. First year, the students go to Israel. There is a Hebrew Union College there in Jerusalem, and they study modern Hebrew. Other things as well, but that's a core part of why they're there. And modern Hebrew is an artificial reconstruction of Mishnaic Hebrew, and that is a good way for them into the text. However, the older biblical Hebrew, often known as classical Hebrew, was much more difficult. This is often the case. Languages simplify as time passes. Go to Chaucer. Is that English? And it was like that with Hebrew. So second year, some of them came back with inadequate skills with biblical Hebrew. Inadequate not because they hadn't done the first year well, but because of their lack of a background in Hebrew. And so I got to teach classes in text, and I did that for several years. And it was a lot of fun.
Did you get any resistance from the students because you were a Christian rather than a Jew?
Oh, I thought you were going to say because I was Australian.
Well, that too.
No, there was an Australian student there, and we became friends we didn't have much contact, but we had good contact when we did. No, there was an interesting clash because I was teaching at the level of grammar and linguistics, and when I learned Hebrew, the textbook used Latin terms for Hebrew. It's outrageous, but they knew all the terms in Hebrew. I knew them in Latin, and some of the Latin, when they heard it, they heard Hebrew. And so we had some things to sort out. But I also prepared for them cheat sheets. And to do that, this was early days in computing, and Epson brought out a printer where you could download your own characters. And so I wrote a program to describe and download to the printer Greek and Hebrew so I could give them in printed form. It was dot matrix, old days, but that was not generally available. I was one of the first ones to do that.
Okay, I have only 2 or 3 more questions, and let's get other people in here as well. What was your dissertation topic?
Now, my dissertation topic was in the Septuagint. So up through my comprehensives, I studied on the Hebrew side. And then I switched fields to my dissertation, which was in a field and an aspect of Hebrew and the Greek text of 1 Samuel, known as the Lucianic text. The Lucianic text of 1 Reigns. We'll talk in subsequent weeks about the names of books, and I'll give you a chart that lists the Hebrew, the Greek, and the Latin and the English, and you'll see some development there.
Is that when you first became very seriously interested in the Septuagint?
No, actually not. Back at further back at Sydney University, in my second year, we had an hour a week of textual criticism. I will be using this term often. We didn't sit there and criticize the text. This is the careful analytical study of the text. And we'll talk more about this and about the variants and how we are able to reconstruct the original Hebrew and to the extent in which we can do it. And we had to write a paper, and there were 3 topics. The first was the Samaritan Pentateuch, and we'll talk more about that later. The second was the Septuagint, and a third about some manuscripts. I'm still not sure which ones it was, although I think if I had the list, I would recognize them. And I chose the Septuagint. And so I wrote my paper. At the time, I was studying with Wolsey Hall in Oxford because I had signed up for a London University Bachelor of Divinity, which you could do by correspondence. And the folder is from there. My handwritten paper was where I first met the Septuagint, and that was it. I was hooked on the Septuagint.
Wow, you used earlier the expression, what my heart beat for. Was
Yes.
that regarding the Septuagint?
No, not particularly. I discovered that I am hardwired for text. So I can't apologize without blaming God. I am hardwired for text, and the further I get from that, the harder it is to maintain interest. So I stay with the text, and that has given me a fascinating life.
Okay, 2 more questions then. When did you know that you are hardwired for text?
I invited the question, having raised that, at Hebrew Union College. I believe, yes, I don't think I was conscious of it until I attempted to take a course in biblical history, ancient Near East history. And I simply could not stomach it. Not because of the content, but it was just, I didn't have any room to understand it. And so later I read John Bright's History of Israel, 3rd edition, and other books around it, and did it on my own, which left me at that other time extra time to do some other things in my preparation.
Okay, one last question. This has been a really interesting journey, but you did not take it all on your own. You had a family, right? And how was that working out?
Absolutely. So first off, Ellen and I were married in 1966 after I finished college. As it turned out, in 1952, for 6 months, the 2 of us were in the same class together in Christchurch, New Zealand. Some friends of mine, of Eleanor's parents, persuaded them that Eleanor should be in Christian education. And they were, her father was a dairy farmer, and so there was no school nearby. That lasted for 6 months. I don't remember Eleanor, but I do remember helping a girl with spelling, and I tell her it must have been her. So when we met at college, we traced our histories together and found where they met. We're married in 66. We were sent to New Zealand, the North Island of New Zealand, for 3 years. Then we were brought back to Sydney for 9 years, the Greater Sydney Conference. And there our 2 children were born, Clinton with a Y, Clinton and Danelle. And you've probably noticed that Danelle is on this morning and that Eleanor is too. And so I attended 2 seminary extensions at Avondale, and the second one was taught by Dr. Jim Cox. And he took an interest in me. I was sitting there with the Greek text open, and I'd finished 2 years of Hebrew at that time. And so he encouraged me to go on and invited me to Avondale, and I went there. And I had a day to decide what to do. And during that time, I felt God saying to me, you have wanted to do this. This is the opportunity. The children are 3 and 5. It probably will never happen again, but it's your choice whether you want to go. And I chose to come over here. And that opened up a good, an opportunity to me, which I took and I haven't regretted. And as I was working through my doctorate, it was fascinating to listen to Eleanor explain to others what I was doing. And it was important to us to keep in communication all the way through the graduate school experience. And every day at 4 o'clock, I was home to play with the kids. And I gave them that focus, and we always, weekends were for family, especially on Sabbath and on Sunday, actually, until they went to bed. And then I went back to class. And Clinton and Aunt Lee at the moment, our granddaughter, may be listening to this. And if they are, hi to you. And I have appreciated all of these, and thank you for taking me there, Dave.
Okay, I said only one more. I have one more, and that is, I recall that Johnny Ramirez was part of this story as well. Is that correct?
That is absolutely correct. So when I went back, when I left HUC, I went back to ministry and was invited to New York conference. And I was sent to ministers' meetings ahead of the union session. And while there, I met Johnny, and we had been in class together. It's a class with a terrible name, Readings and Religious Literature. Say that fast 10 times. But when he saw me, he and his wife invited us to lunch there, and we got talking. He was studying at Harvard, and I told him what I was doing and about Frank Moore-Cross, the professor there, and what I was interested in. And he picked up the phone and dialed the office there at Harvard and asked to speak to Cross, and he wasn't there. But the assistant said, call him at home. Here's the number. I confess I wouldn't have done that to most of the professors at HUC, but I called him at home. World-class scholar. He was very gracious and invited to meet with him the next day. Fast forward, he was editor of the Harvard Semitic Monographs and published my dissertation in 2 volumes.
Wow. Okay. Well, thank you. Have I failed to ask you a question I should have?
You've been comprehensive. No, I don't have any. I wish he had at all. I've enjoyed this, and I thank you for taking the time.
Oh, thank you for doing this. Let's see what questions or comments other people have, okay? And Forrest is sort of managing the queue here. And these questions can be about Bernard's life, or they could also be about his thinking as it's developed over the years. Who would like to have the first question or first comment?
Well, the first thing I say, if you would just raise your hand, wave it, I'll try to recognize you. I do have 2 screens here that I have to look at. So if I don't see you right away, I will catch you. So just wave your hand and we'll take a look at you. And I do have a question I'd like to ask first, if I could. Dr. Taylor, you said you didn't know how to study the Bible. Could you unpack that a little bit?
Yes. I had not been, my background was doctrine, and when I saw text, I looked for doctrine. And so when you are doctrinally inclined, you proof text to back up the theology that you are, that is your understanding of how God is, how God communicates, and so on. But to simply sit down and exegete a narrative, I had no idea how to do that. And it began, apart from my journey all along the way, the practice of it came when I was translating the several of the books of Samuel Kings, and I didn't know how to exegete a text. And so I translated the Greek, the Septuagint, took it to my Sabbath school class and distributed it amongst them, and we worked our way through. The advantage of that is that they didn't know Hebrew, they didn't know Greek, but they could read English. And they raised very important questions. And so we went through, and we noted in 1 Samuel that Hannah spoke. And when she raised the issue and verbalized it, it changed everything. Then we came to chapter 3 and Samuel, and at the end, it said of Samuel, not one of his words fell to the ground. And that to me was the confirmation that this was meant to be understood in its own right, and this was the access to God. So the stories, if the question is, what is God like? For me, the answer is, let me tell you a story. And so the narratives were recorded.
Do you want to follow up on that for us?
No, I think that's actually interesting in the sense that when I started ministry, we used proof text. And so we were very doctrinal. We didn't spend time trying to determine, even though I didn't know Hebrew that well, and still don't. And New Testament, it wasn't important. It was what we had said it meant to support our doctrinal positions.
Well, let
Yes.
me nudge on that just a little bit. I take the point that we should not remove them from their context, from their linguistic and historical and theological context, the meaning of any text. On the other hand, isn't it possible to trace some themes throughout all these texts that are worth considering and not jettison them simply because we're not reading the whole document in which we find these themes? So is there a middle ground between proof texting on the one hand and thematic analysis on the other, and then reading the text as a historical document as such? Anybody want to run at that?
I'm a biblical scholar. I'm not a theologian. I used to think I would like to be a theologian. We have theologians, and we need theologians, but that's not where my heart beats, going back to that again. What was originally said, and what did it say? And you see, after you have studied the rabbinic writings, every word was important to them, and they may have overstudied it, but it taught me to see what was there, not view it as a potential help or hindrance to understanding my doctrines and proof texts. And so I respect theologians. I'm not a theologian, but I have a lot to offer when you actually get to understand what the text is saying.
You know, that difference between being a biblical scholar and a theologian may be one that is not widely mentioned. Could you say more about that?
Well, I'm tiptoeing amongst the tulips, but systematic theology is a branch of philosophy. That's a statement. There's nothing derogatory about that. It used to be called dogmatics, and that got to be derogatory, and so it was systematic theology. And what you are suggesting has served well. Yes, 39 books in the Old Testament, a lot of material. There are those who have a systematic mind and approach it systematically to help all the other people who have a systematic mind. I just never fitted that mold. I'm not right. I'm not wrong. It's just, that's how I'm hardwired. And all I can say is I'm glad I found that fact, because life would not have been as fulfilling for me if I had not found. Now, I'm glad it's also my life calling is not playing putt-putt golf or something, but I'm happy where I'm at.
Okay, somebody else.
Now, did you have your hand up?
Beryl, did you want to say something? Okay.
I thought you, okay, what about Karen? Did you have your hand up? I guess I'm kind of, no? Okay. By the way, if I could just kind of jump on that too. You know, in one of the presentations I made, there was discussions very briefly about Pesher, to take a text which was done 500 years before and put it into the New Testament. Is that kind of what you're talking about, David? To use a text again, rather than just its original purpose?
Well, yeah, I'm not sufficiently knowledgeable about that particular example, but I'll try something that may or may not make sense, and I'd like to hear what Bernard and others think about this. And that is, it seems to me that there are two ways to study the Bible. One of them would be to study it as a literary classic that anybody should know about, just like people should know something about Plato and something about Confucius or whatever. That doesn't mean one has to believe anything in the Bible, but after all, the Bible is the single most widely read book in the whole history of humanity. And just to be an educated person, one ought to know something, one ought to know a lot about the Bible. But that doesn't mean that any more than that it's a classic. And I think lots of people who attend the meetings of the Society of Biblical Literature view it as a classic and give their lives to studying it as a classic, but they would not find it necessarily helpful in guiding their lives today. I can teach Buddhism, not so very well, but I can do it. And they can teach what the Old Testament says and without having to be committed to it. Or one can teach Marxism without being committed to it. So anyway, there's a classic text, and we ought to study it in and of itself and for its reason. Now, for those of us who are believers, the text is not just a classic, it's a canon. And when one shifts from it being a classic to it being a canon, then lots of other things go on. It seems, and I'll run back to the Wesleyan quadrilateral here because it's so easy for me. It seems to me that the scriptures would be one of those factors, perhaps, well, not perhaps, certainly the most important of the four, but if we're going to use the text as a canon and not merely as a classic, we have to study the history of interpretation. We also have to study what we can learn from the non-biblical world. We have to know something about what the scientific issues here are, and then we need to attend to our own experiences too. So it's moving from the study of the text as a classic to moving it to the study of the text as a guide or a canon or a rule for our lives requires the work of biblical scholars, but it also requires the work of psychologists, sociologists, philosophers, scientists, and whatever to get involved in that conversation. So, Bernard, what do you think?
Yeah, we've now, of course, moved into some wider fields, and that's what we're here for. I think it's important that it be expressed as carefully as you have expressed it. For instance, you didn't say we can just read it as a classic work, as a piece of classical literature. And what I am interested at the core of it, I want to read the text in its context as close to the original time as our knowledge of the languages allow. Now, you introduce canon, and we will talk more about that, but it will help, I think, in the discussion to recognize that canon is part of the language of the theologian, not of the biblical scholar. And the biblical, in a postmodern age, the background that I have, though I didn't immediately realize it, is of great advantage, because if the question to what is God like, the answer is, let me tell you a story, then we are in the postmodern world, not entirely, but we have the Old Testament period. The Israelites of the Old Testament period had their stories to tell. They believed that their God was living at work and his work could be seen. Let me illustrate. When they went from Exodus into Canaan, which became the promised land, the locals were worshiping the cycle of nature. Summer, fall, winter, spring, summer, fall, winter, spring. And their rites and ceremonies centered around that. And we don't need to go into any more detail of that. Here come the Israelites. And they, as it were, this is a metaphor, they took the cycle of nature, which goes round and round, added spokes, spokes and no, where's the spoke? Anyway, they made a wheel out of it. And that cycle now moved through time and left a trail in the sands of time. And they believed in a careful examination of certain events, certainly not everything. They could see their God at work. And it was this linear action, this moving horizontally, moving through time. I hope I'm going the right way for you, I'm not sure. It moved through time. And around the 9th, 8th century, the traditions that they had been carrying orally were written down. It turned an agrarian economy literary. It's remarkable. And they made the necessary provisions for these to be supported. And there were prophets who spoke to their own time. They were telling story through their prophecies, through their writings. These were stories to specific places at that time. They were not giving long-term predictions. That's where apocalyptic came in. When prophecy ceased, they studied these writings and realized their God had tried to communicate to them, but they hadn't been listening. And so they took these gems lying on the surface. They didn't need to dig into below that where many more were, and put together like rays of light on a screen, like laser beams on a screen, different colors, different shapes, and stood back and were surprised in this mix of the past. They saw an individual of the future that was the Messiah. And that gave them something to grow into, and Jesus stepped into that. These are the writings out of which they came. And these are what the rabbis studied so closely and taught me to see these details. You can't understand them until you can see them. And it took a lot of work and a lot of time and countless hours of just going over and over and over it. That's what brings to life the past, how God dealt with them, and what sort of God he was. And I have come to luxuriate in Old Testament stories because their picture of their God, he's alive, he's involved, he has a plan and a purpose. He begins with them, brings them back from captivity, go out and evangelize the world. Unfortunately, they never did. This isn't dry or uninteresting or irrelevant. It speaks to us. And the problem we have today is because we keep looking to the past for our illustrations, trying to understand the present. They looked in the present and found their God. We accept the results, we deny the method.
So you said their God was alive, involved, purposeful, intentional, and was interested in their outreach, their evangelism, and that we, by inference or implication, not inference, by implication, you've said we should be doing the same thing. That is, we should be seeing the work of God in our lives and in our surroundings similarly to how they did in theirs. Is that correct?
Yes, yes. We need to find those analogies here. Jesus used parables because people instantly understood. We have volumes and volumes and volumes that we read where people trying to explain what it meant. The point is lost. We need to be able to point to the present.
Okay, somebody else want to jump in here?
Yes, I have Ladon, and then I have Peter after that. I might mention to you, you can raise your hand through the participants part at the bottom. So I can see you both ways that way. So Ladon and then Peter.
Thank you. Thank you, Bernard, for that presentation. I wanted to bring up a point that you mentioned as far as a scholarship and being devoted to the meaning that we want to extract. This is a time for a lot of political discussions. And my passion about that leads a lot of discussion. People ask me about my opinion, and I tend to be on the left. And so there's a lot of labels that are used. And it's just like we already know what they mean, and we already reject ideas. We talk about communism, we talk about socialism, we talk about capitalism without actually realizing what they mean. We look at people taking those ideas and making horrible decisions about the basic ideas and rejecting the basic idea, just like our theology. So I wanted to use this discussion to say that when you make a decision about somebody presenting an idea, and words come up, like words that have all these connotations, just like a doctrinal study. capitalism, socialism, communism, Marxism, whatnot. And we already in America, there are ideas bombarded with fear and prejudice that most people don't know the real meanings of that. What you presented as far as the real meaning of tax reminded me of that. A lot of times we make decisions based on fear without actually looking at the real meaning of what things people are referring to or saying. So I wanted to thank you for bringing that up, because a lot of times in religious discussions as well, we refer to ideas when really they are meaningless, taken out of context, taken out because of the other people's manipulations of those basic ideas. And I wanted to plead with my fellow Americans, the way we are, to be very careful and studious about our decision makings, just like you exhorted. Thank you. That's what I want to say.
Thank you, LaDon.
Okay, Peter.
Can I respond? Just
Please go ahead.
thank you, LaDon, for what you said. And you also reminded me of a characteristic at Hebrew Union College. Hebrew Union College is the home of Reformed Judaism. Reformed Judaism was determined to be in the present, and early on they even worshipped on Sunday. They made their way back to Shabbat. I don't know how long it took, but in the 21st century, well, in the 20th century when I was there too, but especially into the 21st century, they belong in the center of the current discussions about equality and racism and so on. They have no presuppositions as to who is acceptable in Judaism, in rabbinic school. Who you are is who you are. Come and join us, and you will be you represent others who need your ministry, and they're on the front line all along the way. They are willing to protest and to support. It has an interesting consequence because they have been open to intermarriage with whomever. However, just a little while ago, they realized they were facing extinction because of the rate at which they were diluting who it was that they were. And they are looking deeply into that. But it taught me a lot of things: how to be open, how to be honest, and to assess my own presuppositions. The only way I know to do that is to ask myself a question I don't know the answer to and watch how I answer. It drags up the presuppositions, and it's a big help in understanding myself.
I think the Bible has stated very clearly, and Jesus has stated very clearly, what we need to be beholden to: justice, mercy, loving kindness. And I think we have enough to go by that.
Yes. And in the Old Testament, justice and righteousness are the same term in Hebrew and in Greek, and I think Latin too. They're not two different concepts.
Okay.
Yeah, Peter, unmute yourself. Get your technician in there.
Wait, Peter, we need you to unmute yourself. Just put your hand on the space bar. That's all you have to do.
Yeah, I can mute people, but I can't unmute. When I unmute them, it just sends a message. So
I don't know if I can. I'll try.
No, his technician just came.
people can control their unmuting. And that's a reasonable. It's an understandable feature. So anyway.
Okay, Peter, if you put your hand on the space bar, just push the space bar down. As long as your hand is on the space bar, you will be unmuted. Well, let's what should we do? Because Peter, we can't hear you.
David, it's not really true. I tried this spacebar thing. I'm using a Chromebook. On a Chromebook, it doesn't work. Maybe a PC or a Mac.
Okay, let me see. Apparently that's not working.
What also works is if you go to your picture and in the top right-hand corner, when you put your cursor there, it'll come up unmute. And that's what I just did. I never touched the space bar.
All right, Peter.
Peter, you've unmuted yourself. Go for it.
Okay, one more detail, sorry.
My good technician.
The audio can be turned on and off if you click on out and the letter A. Out, A. You have on and off for audio. That's probably the easiest way to do it.
Each program works a little bit differently.
Okay, Peter.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, well, I have a short comment and 2 questions, if I may. The comment, every Friday night, my wife and I, we are watching the Jewish services from the Central Synagogue in New York. They're, I believe they're Reformed Jews. And we like very much the way they are welcoming the Sabbath, lighting the candles, and also welcoming the Sabbath as the queen of the week. And we're very curious, and for a while we're watching these services. But I'd like to tell you one experience. During one of these services, one of the rabbis in his homily mentioned several times that it's okay to curse God. And he said not only once, but several times, it's okay, very nonchalantly, it's okay to curse God. And I was shocked when I heard him. And I sent him a message, and I told him that we are not Jews, but we honor the Sabbath and we like what they are doing, their services. But I was shocked that he told his congregation that it's okay to curse God. And I reminded him about the 3rd commandment, and also what Job answered his wife when she told him that it's okay to curse God and he died. Well, you recall that he told, you are a foolish woman. And I suggested to him that he should apologize to his congregation for this statement. But he never answered back to my message. That is my comment and the 2 questions that I have. In the blurb that you sent us, David, you mentioned that there are 3 main branches of Judaism. And if it's possible for Bernard to tell us the main differences between them and how is the actual situation in Israel these days in regard to these 3 branches. This is the first question. And the second question is the Bible its own interpreter? Because in the Protestant tradition that we have coming from Martin Luther, we are taking only sola scriptura. But listening very carefully, watching what Martin Luther said, he not only said sola scriptura, but he said, if I am convinced by plain reasoning, then to me is not only scripture interpreting itself, but it's also the reason involved in this. And we know that at Council of Trent, the Catholics adopted the two things, sola scriptura, but also the tradition. What can you comment in regard to this?
Well, thank you. Thank you for your questions. First off, it's important for us to understand that Judaism, even at its early roots between the two testaments, as we have been listening in previous weeks, that Judaism is not the linear extension of the Israelite religion, of the Hebrew Bible, of our Old Testament. Some years ago, when he was at the Temple Emmanuel in San Bernardino, Rabbi Cohen came to Winter Wednesdays at University Church to share about Judaism. And Adventists sat there listening carefully, and then afterwards saying, you said thus, but in Leviticus it says such and such. And he said, you Adventists have to understand that Judaism is not the linear extension of Israelite religion. And that's important to understand. Second, you mentioned the three branches. There are more besides that. Those are the main ones. There are also atheistic Jews. And the reason for this principally is you're born a Jew. You have no choice. You're born a Jew. The question then becomes, how are you going to manifest your Judaism? To what will you give expression? What in you will align with which branch? And then beyond that, there are understandings in Judaism, for instance, that for them, it is okay to lie under certain circumstances because, after all, God lied to Abraham because when God told him what Sarah had said, he masked the fact that she said about her husband being old, and this with other references they put together in this fashion. They have different understandings. Now, sola scriptura. I wrote an article about this in Spectrum magazine some years ago. We misunderstand sola scriptura. We have solus scriptus, solus Christus. So this is Christ alone. You can only have one alone in the nominative case, the subject, because sola only makes room for one, and solus is the masculine to match Christus. But it's in the ablative. That is to say, it answers a different question. The question was, how do we interpret Scripture? Sola scriptura, by Scripture alone, or by tradition as well? And Luther said, it is by Scripture, not tradition. That was the question being answered. And so it leaves space for interpretations that sola scriptura, if it's in the other case, to exclude it. And so we are not confined to sola scriptura and shouldn't use any other books. That was never the issue. But because physically they're written the same, they're not pronounced the same, we don't make the difference between them. And there was a second question.
Loss of service.
What was that?
Just these two questions.
Which one didn't I answer?
Bernard, if you can comment on in regard to the comment that the rabbi made that it's okay to curse God. What do you think about that?
Yeah. Okay. Because of their close reading of the text and because of the value they give to each. We'll talk more about this later, but at the time of Jesus, for instance, Rabbinic Judaism believed that Torah, the first 5 books, was the full and final and complete revelation from God. There would be no more. And so by carefully noting matters that don't even appear differentiated in our English translations because we have no English equivalent, they draw upon in their close reading of the text.
Okay, thank you, Peter.
Okay, I have Karen, and then I have Melvin, then I have Monty. So Karen, over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Taylor, for your presentation today and your willingness to share your learning with us over the coming weeks. I also have 2 questions, and I'm going to try to ask the one that I hope has a shorter answer first. My interests follow yours. I like to do word studies, and I'm wondering to what extent, because I feel like I'm denigrating your life's work by even asking this question, to what extent is language a barrier to the text? You know, do I too need to attend Hebrew University, or, you know, anyone who can't approach the text in its original languages? To what extent are we handicapped by that? Then my second question is, if you would share, and maybe this is coming in future weeks, how your spiritual life has been impacted by your study. I can see by your manner how much your study has enriched your life intellectually, but would you talk about its spiritual impact on you?
Thank you. I appreciate the questions. I understand, and whatever, you know, if you knew what went behind an English translation in terms of the number of people and the careful attention to the text, it is a fascinating work, and I have seen the inner workings and the way that it works, and when I first came to Loma University Church, when I took the Wednesday night meetings, when I preached in church, I read from the original, and it was a tremendous experience for me. But some people got the impression that if you didn't have this background, then you couldn't understand it. That was furthest from my intention. So I immediately stopped that, and I only used an English translation to show that it could be gained from there. Is something lost in the process? Yes. Was anything gained in the process? Absolutely. By taking people to the text and reading it with them and helping them to see what it said, what it meant, and what it means today. And so what I'm interested in conveying to you is the amount of work that lies behind this, how hard scholars work to give the best understanding possible, because I accept this as the Word of God. We'll talk further about the Septuagint canon and its relationship, because this is, well, to use the regular expression, the pink elephant in the middle of the room. Because of our understanding of canon, we don't know where to go once we put the Bible down, even though many Bibles include the Septuagint. My personal life, nothing warms me like reading the text, by studying the text. As I say, I'm hardwired for it, and I continually find new insights in it. Many of them I would love to be able to share, but the process is keeps us apart, and I regret that, but it's the necessity of that because of our different backgrounds. But when I was at college, when I was at Avondale, we were told to put our studies aside on Sabbath and read and listen from the heart. I rejected that. What I set out to do was to draw the heart into the text itself, to hear what is said, not what was just emotive in terms of being warmed. The mind needed to be fed. We need to have the understanding, but I never preached the sermon that didn't touch my own heart.
Okay. Thank you, Karen.
I have Melvin, and then I have Monty.
Yes, Dr. Taylor, both George Tishy and Elmer Capino have been singing your praises on Spectrum and urging us to meet with you this morning.
May I interrupt just for a second, Melvin? Could you move your camera down? Because we're just seeing your forehead and not, there we go. A little bit more.
That's probably best.
Okay, here we go.
Let me get in focus here. Anyway, I was saying, okay, here we go. George, both your neighbor, George Tishy, Riverside, and Alma Cucino have been voting meeting with you. However, George has a note. He's be brief. Be very brief with your questions, and I would do that. Number one, Dr. Taylor, do you have any comments? Do you have any current studies on mistranslations for the New Testament?
We will address that the 6th week. One particular example, and others will perhaps come up along the way. One of the important things for me, and I don't remember where it came from, but somebody gave the advice, well, first off, you could go to the ABC and buy a New Testament from 30 different translations or something. And I bought that, but then I found myself shopping through the translations to find something that I liked or that agreed with me. And so I disposed of it. I probably sold it to somebody else, but anyway, and I followed one translation. It used to be the Revised Standard. Now it's the New Revised Standard, not because it's perfect, although it's a very good translation, but because the consistency of the same translators, group of translators, applies all across it, and they give a uniform stamp to it. I have other translations on the shelf, and I'll pull them out, having them on my computer too. It's easy to compare them. But when I stand up, my interest is not so much to say this is a mistranslation, because that creates doubt. We can expand on it, but if everything's a mistranslation, then we give up. Me too, so what do I trust? So thank you for that question.
The second, very briefly, is how can we encourage you to submit your findings online, such as Amazon, or make them available. We hear a lot about you, but I'm not able to read much about your findings online.
Yeah, for better or for worse, and at this stage in life, I think it may be for worse. My publications have been academic, and I don't know whether the University Church still has tapes, series I did in Ruth, and all sorts of series were done. I don't know whether they still have them, but if you got in touch with the media department there, you could listen, and then you wouldn't be disadvantaged because so little is in writing. Sorry.
Thank you, Melvin.
Okay. Don't forget, if you have a question, to raise that little hand in the little box down below. But now we come to Monty.
Yeah, thank you for your presentation, Bernard. I really enjoyed it, and I'm looking forward to future presentations. When you said presentation number 6, I had to smile because I'm thinking, oh, great, he's going to get into some detail for us. So I'm looking forward to all those. A question about, related to your comment about focusing on reading the Bible and thinking about doctrine versus reading the Bible, and I'm not quite sure how you phrased it, but focusing on the text. And I'm just wondering, with that transition, which it sounds like is a good fit for you, what that has led you to in terms of doctrine and thinking about doctrine.
Thank you, Monty, and good to hear from you. Enjoyed the years working with you. They were too short. Yeah, that's a relevant question. As part of reading the text, I do not think doctrinally in the way that I used to. And there is the text, and the text is not written as a systematic theology handbook. And again, I appreciate and sometimes turn in that direction to see what is being with the text. Would we lose anything if everybody was a biblical scholar? Absolutely. First of all, they're not hardwired for that much text. And when it is given to them in a consistent form and takes them through from place to place, look what it has done for the Adventist Church. Though originally we claimed to be people of the text. And when I was leaving Australia, the Sabbath school lessons had come out and were going to go through every book of the whole Old and New Testament. But after a while it foundered because not enough writers knew how to exegete a narrative. And so the task was never completed. And if that didn't meet the need, so be it. But for my part, that's where I have dedicated my life. I don't tear any of this down. That's not what I'm here for. It serves what it serves, and serves well. And some very great minds have been given to this. God gave them the beat of their heart, and I appreciate that they have followed it as well. But most people don't understand the difference between the two, though our goals are the same. And we just reach there by different methods in reading and approaching the same book. Thanks for the question.
May I press on that just a little bit, Bernard? I think maybe in my mind, the question is, what unifies us then? If it's not our doctrinal commitments, plural, or what unifies us? And I suppose there could be two different answers to that, at least. One is that we share a liturgy, particularly around the Sabbath, that unifies us, or we share a story. When we ask new members to join us, we might say, not do you believe the 28 fundamentals, but do you accept this story as your story? And are you prepared to participate in the story now and to continue the story as much as you can into the future? Now, that's a different way of achieving identity as a community than doctrinally. Do you want to comment on that at all?
Yeah, sure. The question could be put another way. Are you willing to suppress what God has called you to in order to pursue what the majority pursue? I've been in this community now for 30 years, and you recognize that I have not been an agent of resistance or denigration. I have appreciated the opportunity to do what I do. And for those who find a responding chord in their heart, fine. Those who don't, I'm not divisive. I certainly don't intend to be. And I listen to their messages and enjoy what they have to say. I'm here today because Dave wanted to explore who I am and what I have done. And there are other aspects that lie behind all of this. I will show you how texts are understood and the input of the Septuagint, Jerome's Vulgate, and other translations like that. They're in your footnotes, but you don't know how to use them, I expect, for the most part. And that's okay. You don't have to, but I think you'd find it interesting to know all that goes into it. So I'm not raising a banner. I'm not trying to invite followers, but if there's a responsive chord, then I appreciate the opportunity to speak to your heart as God has set in my heart.
Well, I'm thankful for that, Bernard. It never occurred to me that the thought of you being divisive never even crossed my mind. So, I don't know we need to go down that negative road because it's never been even a consideration in my view. So, okay, who's next?
Well, we have Eduardo, then I'm going to have Peter.
Dr. Taylor.
Yes, Eduardo.
When Sickbay started his Sabbath school class about Revelation on the same room as we have the class with you, somebody raised the question. He said, why the Lord make Revelation so complicated? And I don't remember the answer, but that night I have a dream. In that dream, I hear a voice saying something like, in order that they would not be a snare. I remember the word snare. And I understood the dream that the Lord is trying to develop the intelligence of human beings in order to the devil do not snare them or confuse them. When you mentioned that the Lord didn't give us a systematic theology, I think that was the purpose, that we should develop our brains in order to understand him, because I see the Catholics schools or Protestant schools of theology are confused. Even more than that, I recently declared to some of the vice presidents of the General Conference that the church is wrong. And I think that we are in the same danger that we can be deceived by the devil by not understanding the doctrines or the history that the Bible portrays, even though it's pieces here and pieces there. Can you comment on that?
Well, it's like in music. The soul of music used to be melody, but we don't have that today. You listen to a classical music station like KUSC, and some of it just seems like pure noise. Well, it's representing the times in which the composer lived. And there is this tradition, as has been mentioned in past weeks, of apocalyptic, and Forrest presented about. There is also the wisdom tradition. The wisdom tradition stands apart. No patriarchs are mentioned in the wisdom literature. It is an excursus, as it were, into, like Ecclesiastes, what if there was no God? And it explores it, and it comes back, whether it was the original author's conclusion or not, and says, you know, fear God and so on. And the book of Revelation is a type of literature, a literature that spoke to a group of people whose hearts beat in tune with that type of literature. And it gave to them a hope and a future. And Jesus stepped into that and called himself Messiah in Hebrew, Mashiach, or Christ, or Christos in the Greek. But in Acts chapter 1, when the disciples said, are you going to set up your kingdom at this time? He said, in effect, I'm done with the metaphor. It doesn't define who I am. It was useful. It was God-directed, but it's not going to determine my future or your future as the founders of the early Christian church. And we need to be able to shed our metaphors. Some are helpful, some were helpful, some are not helpful anymore. And that's why we need to find God in the 21st century. The book of Revelation speaks to those whose heart beats in that manner. And not everybody does. And that's okay. But Scripture hears the voice of God through the wisdom literature, through the patriarchs, through the traditional prophets. All of these came together, and the Jews were willing to hold these together under tension in their Hebrew Bible.
Okay, thank you, Eduardo.
Okay. We have Peter, probably, Peter, you have to unmute yourself. Not yet, Peter. You're still muted.
Press Alt plus A should do it.
He's got his technician there now.
Oh, okay.
All right, good. But
Okay,
I hope
my wife.
hope you pay her a lot to do your technical.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Taylor, you mentioned in regard to the New Testament that you can go to a bookstore and you can find up to 30 different translations. And you pick up one that is fitting you and you like it. Well, it's still important Textus Receptus that goes all the way back to 16th century during Erasmus' time. We know that Erasmus was very interested in translation. The New Testament, he translated 5-6 times. And he was, of course, a grammarian, and he was very knowledgeable in studying Greek and Latin. Then my question is still Textus Receptus important in the study? Consider it as an authority or not?
Well, it is. That's the fact. It was for Christianity. It's first of all the Hebrew Bible that was adopted, and Christianity took that over without any changes. In the New Testament, we had to do it ourselves, and it took a longer period of time. And there are many people like Erasmus that you mentioned and many others, though the text today is not the text of Erasmus. Archaeologists have given us much earlier texts, and with a careful analysis of these, we can see changes that were introduced sometimes by scribes, sometimes by others. And we will look at, we only have time for a few of these, but I want to expose you to those sorts of decisions that have to be made. The text is authoritative for me, and the more disturbing for me is not so much the text, but the way the text is understood. And sometimes I feel that the more I learn, the less I know. But for me, education there are 3 levels. There's what we know, there's what we don't know, and there's what we don't know that we don't know. And a driving reason for going to Hebrew in college is to find out first what I didn't know. I didn't know. Once I learned that, and I knew I didn't know, then I had to find out and learn what it was. But I have retained and built my faith through this process, and have been humbled by the whole process and the wonderful privileges that I have had over the years.
Okay, I think maybe we're out of time for us. Was there anybody else?
I don't see anybody right now.
Okay.
I did want to say, Dr. Taylor didn't tell us that he pastored in upstate New York for a while. So imagine on a day like this, you can remember some of those real cold days in upstate New York.
Yes, we were there.
Okay, I'll have the benediction. Then this part will conclude, and then we can continue talking as long as we want. So here's the benediction. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. Amen.
Dr. Taylor?
Yes.
I know that you're an avid runner. How long have you been a runner? And I'm curious about that. I suspect I have an idea what your motivation is, but how long have you been a runner?
I think it was 14 or 15 years ago I ran my first LA marathon. I only did 2, but I've been running ever since with the Lopas.
Did you ever think that running was abusive?
You mean on the pavement?
Physically. Yes.
Yes. I have been remarkably injury-free with the process, but yeah, sure. But I need to move. I want to be able to run as long as I can. I don't run anywhere near as far as I used to or as fast, and I walk quite a bit too, but yep, still running.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Hey, David, did you want to discontinue the recording at this point or let it continue?
As long as it's of this nature, I think so. If it starts to get more personal, I think I'll turn it off. What do you think?
Well, that's above my pay grade.
Okay. Well, I'll just say, there's Peter. I'm looking forward to hearing what the rabbis say about the story of the binding of Isaac. There must be more than one rabbinic view of that, and someday I hope we'll get there. But Peter was going to say something now.
Can you tell us a little bit about the situation in Israel right now regarding the different branches of Judaism, how they can deal with all of this? And because I know that some of them, they do not want to do military service, and can be some conflicting situations there.
I'm not really au fait with Judaism, and in fact, it hasn't quite risen to the level of a regret, but when I went to Hebrew Union College, I was not there to study Judaism, although I participated some and enjoyed doing that. But that's certainly one thing I would change if I were to go back. The family enjoyed the times that we attended services like Simchat Torah, the end of the reading at the end of the year of Deuteronomy, and then going back to Genesis and starting reading through again. And the joyous dancing around it wasn't a synagogue, it was well, maybe it was at Hebrew Union College. It was during the week, as it turned out. That was when it appeared on the calendar. It wanders through the calendar. It's not a weekly Sabbath event each year.
We haven't heard from McKinley.
Hello, Dr. Taylor.
Yes.
You want to hear from McKinley. Well, I was debating whether to ask this question, but since I will not be on next week, I'll ask my question. First, Dr. Taylor, thank you for sharing. Many people, many Christians face the challenge of discerning or discovering a purpose for their lives. My favorite Adventist pastor gave a presentation titled Created for a Purpose, and then another one titled Person in the Making. And those two highlight the challenge. You said at some point you discerned that the coursework you followed was by God's guidance. Here's the question. Can you point to things in your life up to that point that led you to the discovery that the path you chose were by God's guidance?
Yes, it goes back to when I was in high school. May have been my last year in high school. There was a week of devotion. I found those quite confusing, and I went to the speaker that year, who was the conference youth leader, and I said, I've noticed over the years that weeks of prayer are conducted by people who have a life behind them that a life of sin, and they wandered, and then they came back, and then they conduct this series of meetings now in the present, and and they often luxuriated in what had happened in the past. And then Thursday night, you had to promise that you would never do what they had done. And then Friday night was the dedication. And I found that quite disturbing. But through all of that, there settled upon me a sense of calling to ministry. Now, my temperament does not lean me in those sorts of directions, and there are not a lot of points in my life that I can turn to and say, God made me do it. Now, I mentioned when we were coming to America that God gave me the choice. It was very clear to me, and that it was my decision. I didn't have to. I had wanted to go. Here we were. Now do we go? And so, given that choice, I was free to follow my heart, and so we wound up here. I find God like the Old Testament writers did in the events that they recorded. We have them at our disposal so we can see what they experienced and see if they find a response in our hearts, and they still do in mine. I enjoy the reading and studying that I do. I always keep heart and mind together. Sometimes it gets technical so that I might understand better, but then it comes back to, so where does this leave me in relationship to this text? And I don't have to do that every day. It's nice when it happens, but I am one given to a lot of thought. Back in Australia, where there were water sprinkling restrictions, I used to love to stand outside and hold the hose. I was fully occupied, but I was free to pursue my thoughts in whatever direction they needed to go. And so I've worked my way along this path. I have no formula. I can't say, now, if you do this and then you do that. I have had to work on my own, and with my temperament, that's pretty much automatic. But I welcome this opportunity to share, and if anyone finds my affirmation helpful, then I'm delighted, but I will pursue it even if not.
Yeah, I think it's a fascinating story, and I hope that the church and our Adventist family have taken advantage of the blessings that you discovered or you received along this path. Thank you for sharing.
Thank you.
Dr. Taylor, it's Elmer Capino.
Yes.
I have a question. You
Yes.
train
Here we go. I want to emphasize something that Bernard just said, and that is, here are his words, I think. There settled upon me a sense of my calling, all right? There settled upon me a sense. And I think that we need to recognize that that's the way God more typically works, and more rarely works with blinding people and transforming them from Saul into Paul in a split of a second. It's more this settling upon me a sense. And then he also talked about, I felt free to follow my heart. Okay, we can be confident that God will lead us in a way that fits with who we are, rather than a way that's just discontinuous with the kinds of people we happen to be. Okay, Daniel, I think you were next.
In science, we have considerable training and effort to distinguish between signal, noise, and bias. I wonder, in your studies, how you might be able to distinguish between those three?
Well, it's part of my training too. It's not confined to science. And those are very much the concerns. I have ideas, some I've had for decades, weighing in. The 6th week, I will share one of those, and I am continually evaluating, criticizing something that has happened, and I am text-based. I am always. Thanks, Rick. I am always open to suggestion. I share my ideas with peers and with others, and you can. I stood here at University Church and preached and taught and so on, and I was heard gladly. People would stop me and appreciate the detail that I went into of how the events related to the history of the time and how helpful it was to them. And I have ideas that I have to discard, but that's like science along the way. And you have to get outside the lab and go somewhere, I expect, go for a walk or just go about it and let it mellow and sleep on it. And I don't rush to conclusions, but I work carefully, and I appreciate the question.
I forgive me, please. I may have misphrased it somehow. I wasn't intending to somehow challenge your integrity. I was rather interested in what do you do when you encounter a verse that appears to be, for whatever reason, discordant with what you would expect it to be.
Well, perhaps you're talking about something like this. Fairly early in my ministry, I was reading in Hebrews, and I came across the verse, "The word of God is quick and powerful and sharper than any two-edged sword." And my immediate response was, that doesn't belong there. And then I laughed out loud because that's where it came from. And it was my failure to understand it, to place it in its context. And that was a waypoint along the way. And when that happens, then, and it happens often, well, it more previously, because I had a head full of systematic theology and conclusions of how it should fit. And so, yeah, that catches your attention. That's when you stop and say, wow, I didn't realize I was misunderstanding it to that extent. And then you understand it in its oh, yes. I'm glad that happened. Thanks.
Dr. Taylor, have you had discussions with your brother-in-law on the text that he discussed this morning, the Hebrews, not Romans 7? He presented his suggestion about the text, Hebrews 13, 1-7. And I was wondering, what did you think of that?
I haven't heard it. I have heard of it, and so we've not had opportunity to discuss it, and I'm certainly not going to go on record here making any sort of sorts of comments when I haven't
No, I'm
given
not
him.
asking. I just was wondering if he had taken your input on it, but he's a scholar on his own, and I thought that presentation was well done.
Good. I'm glad it helped you. No, we just haven't had occasion to do that.
Okay.
Which text was it, LaDon? Was it? I thought you said Hebrews 13 and Romans 7.
I'm sorry, not Hebrews. It's Romans 13, 1-7, about obeying authorities. He presented his thinking on obeying authorities because they are from God, and if you are doing good, then no harm from you. And he changed it, and he says, what if the text says, obey the police, and if you're good, no harm come from you? And he says, I don't think, at least the way I understood that, he said he doesn't think that the text was written by Paul because it's not consistent with his overall message of love.
Where was he?
So Romans 13, verse 7.
1 through 7.
1 through 7. Okay. Thank you.
It's he did a very nice presentation. I was very much for it. I mean, it doesn't make sense. Even though Sigva thinks it is real and it's better than chaos, he parted with Sigva's interpretation.
David, Elmer Capino has had his hand up quite a while.
Yeah, is Forrest still here?
No.
Sorry,
okay,
I
Elmer.
Sorry.
Okay, Dr. Taylor, thanks for the presentation, but I have a question. You trained at the Hebrews University, and my understanding is they consider Jesus as a rabbi. Did that ever affect your studies? Did that affect your faith?
Yes, impacted directly. I was in a class, probably a Targum class, the Aramaic translations of the Hebrew Bible, but we were given an assignment written by Giza, and it didn't make, no, not that, I was surprised that a Jewish author was approaching it in the manner in which he did. And I asked the professor, who is this guy? But he never answered. And it was many years later. And I mentioned this a week or two ago. And he was in Germany, and he was Jewish. His parents put him in the, he became a priest in the Catholic Church. And so he was able to survive the Second World War, and then he began a pilgrimage heading east from Germany, ending up at Oxford. And it was the mixture of his priest training and the entering into his Judaism gave him a clear picture that Jesus was a rabbi, and Jesus was Jewish. Now, of course, the response to that is, well, of course, but people weren't viewing him in that way. And so he wrote his autobiography. I had it. I haven't located it. I don't know whether I lent it to somebody, didn't get it back, or whether it was, I just don't remember where I put it, but it was a fascinating read. And of course, that is pretty much taken for granted, and how do you speak against it? And so he was a product of his time, and he was a shaper of his time, and those two forces came together. And it's unfortunate that Christianity has moved so far away from those roots in some ways, but we are where we are, and we go from here.
That's a big topic, isn't it? How Christians and Jews should relate to each other today, particularly in our in view of our very, very painful history. It's It's a very serious matter. I know Sigrid Tonstad's attended to it, and I know you have, but we all need to think about that very carefully. Who's next? Rick, were you about to say something?
There's a lady called Kirsten who raised her hand.
Thanks. I've been listening to this with great fascination, and I've got to go. But I want to thank Bernie for his biography and his insights, and also look forward to his further comments. Someday I want to engage him about the difference between, or the purpose of theology, and some of the ways in which he characterized it. But to do that would send us down a long road of interaction, I think. So maybe later. But thanks again, Bernie. It was really, really interesting. One question I was going to ask is whether there were any Reconstructionist Jews that you encountered while studying at Hebrew Union College.
More since then than, well, I think there were some there. Yeah, there are quite a few different breeds. And the question is, what do I do with my Judaism? Who am I, and how do I relate to Judaism? And Judaism is sort of like Catholic orders, is happy to have categories, even those that are polar opposites. There's room enough for them all.
Yeah, I met a Jewish rabbi, traveled with us for a few days during one of the trips that Bailey Gillespie and I took to the Middle East. And he turned out he was a rabbi at a conservative congregation in Indianapolis, but he identified himself as a Reconstructionist. And I'd run into that phrase when I was in college, but really didn't know anything about it. And he said, we are more liberal in our theology than Reform Jews, and even more than Reform Jews, and more conservative in our life commitments and our liturgy and so on than conservative Jews. And for me, that was a very interesting combination, because typically we think of people whose theology is more liberal. Well, their lifestyle will sort of go in that direction too, and vice versa. And yet here was somebody who put things together in a very interesting way. And then what little I've read about it since then, Mordecai Kaplan, the founder of Reconstructionist Judaism, was also one who signed the Humanist Manifesto in the US years ago. And his daughter was the first, what would you say, bat mitzvah. So he departed from very, very conservative Judaism in some ways. But somebody told me that he read it, was a colleague, Jeff Gang, told me that it was Mordecai Kaplan who used the triad believing, behaving, belonging to describe Judaism, and maintained that belonging was the most important of the three. Well, I used that triad to entitle a little book I wrote about the importance of community about 20 years ago. And I didn't know it, and I got it from that rabbi in our conversations during our days together in Israel. And when he described Judaism as involving three things, believing, behaving, and belonging was the most important of the three as far as establishing Jewish identity, I thought that was an interesting title to give a book that I wrote trying to emphasize the importance of community within the Adventist church.
Yes, thank you.
Oh, anyway. I'm glad to hear that you had such a diverse experience in Cincinnati, of all places.
Yeah, my orthodoxy and orthopraxy don't line up either.
Okay. Anyway, I got to say goodbye to all of you. Fascinating discussion, though.
Thanks for staying by. Thanks for